my name is Micaiah Stevens. Welcome to Game Design 7B, as we're now calling it. I'm developing a game for Hamlet. It's available on Steam, and I'm working for a company called Haven Studios. You can email us or leave a comment, or however you wish to. Um, so, anyways, we're talking about this concept of roguelikes. 7A was roguelikes, and now we're moving on. We talked a little bit about the MUDs, and so now we're talking about MUDs for 7B. We'll talk about mud, not the dirt and water kind, the actual mud. Gaming, mud game. Anyways, and then most famously, the one that I played a lot was the DikuMud. I never had a telecomputer, sort of a client computer, whatever you'd call them at the time, teletypes or whatever. My buddy had one, and that sort of continued on. I sort of watched my brother play Everquest, and then eventually I got my own computer, and then internet was kind of a problem as well. But eventually, and then we also played Warhammer Fantasy role-playing in high school, around 95, so 93 to 95, so that's sort of where and then we'll talk about the next. Anyways, we're talking about this roguelike, and now we're talking about MUDs. This is part two. So we talked about, this is sort of the iteration of this topic. We talked about the roguelike, which started with the rogue. And now we're talking about part two as multiplayer rogue, as we called it. So we're going to be talking about MUD, EverQuest, and then Warhammer. And then part three, we'll be talking about this 2D versus 3D. And then it might actually lead into a great discussion that I think we should have next. What happened? Anyways, just a quick background. Rogue in 1980 was the sort of forebearer of this, which spawned Moria, Ainban, Zingban. So Ainban was in 1990. And 94 was Zingban. It's the etymology of these sort of rogue-like dungeons. I think sort of, but a part of that is inspired from this game. I think, which the sort of the precursor for the rogue was Adventure in 1976. It was on a Play-Doh computer. I'm not quite familiar because I was born in 1976, so that's how old this is. Anyway, so this is kind of a screenshot from Adventure. It was, you can sort of see that it's sort of these, it's very similar to a text-based adventure game. You can kind of think of it out now. But there wasn't a lot of graphics in these games. It's kind of where the rogues are sort of ASCII graphics. These are sort of text. So you can sort of really see the role-playing of these and sort of the exploration. Anyway, so you're standing at the edge. I'm not sure how, I'm not a really good role player, but anyways, you can sort of see that we'll go through the text here and we'll see, you're standing at the edge of a road before a small brick building. Around you is a forest. A small stream flows out of the building and down a gully. And then you type in go in. You're inside a building, a well housed for a large spring. So there's some keys on the ground here. There's a shiny brass lamp nearby. There is food here. There's a bottle of water here. So it sort of gives you a sort of text-based adventure. Sort of when you actually type in commands, you might type in pickup. I think we'll actually get into a little bit of that code discussion later, where you might actually type pickup keys or something. You'd actually have to. I think they're all in capital letters, which is great because later on you might have to. Case sensitive and some of these, and anyway, so it's like, and you can also type a look at, and it's sort of this, sort of, you can see where the text adventure and then adventure games and sort of, I guess, it's almost ironic that Rogue inspired an entire roguelike, Adventure inspired entire adventure-like games. So we are not creating adventure-like games, so I guess that's sort of, I guess it dawned on me how ironic this sort of is. Anyway, so then we got into Daiku. Daiku was sort of I think DikuMud was sort of the ability because of the, you were typing text commands into the server, and that's sort of how you would interact with the world. And then this is sort of this sort of same idea where you have this various abilities and stats and equipment, and so it's like you get the same roguelike. This is kind of an example of DikuMud, which we'll talk about mud coders eventually at the end. We'll showcase some of that. And this is a screenshot from them, I believe, are talking about this idea that, and you can sort of see that you can have the syntax here of quaff, and then and then it has the brackets of the potion, and then you can recite a scroll or a target, and then you can zap the target as well. So you get these key commands and abilities. You have to hold the staff in order to brandish it. So, anyways, and then that's sort of this idea of the DikuMud. It was hard pressed to try to find some examples of DikuMud code, and because it's really, it's like I don't know. They're really fun at the time because they were. It felt like you were playing a character, and they were actually quite difficult as well. There wasn't permadeath. In the muds, you would actually die and you drop all your equipment. In fact, I actually got up to level 20-ish or so on this game, and then I fell asleep playing and I died. And like I went back the next day and all my gear had rotted away and it was just stolen. It was just kind of horrible. So, not a big fan of permadeath or losing your gear. Anyway, so we'll talk a little bit about that, and that led into this famous game called Everquest. You can sort of see a little bit of the text-based sort of here, where you sort of get this. You get a character, then he has this character has the health, stamina, and health, mana, and stamina, or something like that. And then you got groups, and then you're actually targeting this sand giant. So, anyways, we talked about Adventure in 1976, and that's sort of the inspiration for this, and then Diku is sort of the inspiration from the Rogue, and then there's a kind of a big history of Diku, and I think we'll actually bring up a crazy chart of that, which I can barely see, but hopefully you'll be able to see better. Maybe we'll zoom in, and then that sort of gets down to Everquest in 1999. So I graduated high school in 95, so I was playing a little bit of Warhammer, so maybe we should have included that first, but it's sort of playing this it's a tabletop. You get a game book, you get character sheets, and you sort of talk about that. You ran into, you were exploring the desert and you ran into a sand giant. The sand giant looks mad and starts attacking the party. So then you're like, oh, roll for initiative, and that's sort of, I think a lot of this is sort of these ideas is through this sort of. But yeah, and then Everquest also had the same sort of Diku sort of example of you would have, I played a druid, I think, because druids were pretty OP at the time, and really self-containing, and I had a really good friend that was a druid, and so there's a lot of. I didn't actually get to play. Mostly it was like I didn't have a computer at the time, my own computer. We had sort of a family computer, and my brother had a computer, and then he moved out. And the other thing too was it was hard to sort of. It's probably strange to imagine, but it was hard to get sort of home internet back then. It was like really expensive. In fact, it was famously, super expensive. So I think, when we finally did sort of, and then these are kind of expensive. They're $15 or $20. I don't remember what the subscription. There was a subscription rate, I believe, at the start. So. And anyway, so we were playing bulletin board system games at the time because they were sort of between 1995 and 2000, and then eventually we got into StarCraft more instead of the online even though we were playing LAN games of StarCraft, so we'd have people would bring their computers over for the weekend. So. But eventually I did pick up Everquest and played quite a bit. Played quite a bit of the game eventually. I never really, but then I sort of, World of Warcraft was sort of the I think it was the availability of a PC and the availability of the internet was sort of, I think that's why World of Warcraft became the de facto game at the time. Plus it's, the graphics and sort of it's interesting that you could sort of see the combat logs, but you wouldn't even really notice those as much with the floating combat text and all the cool things that were added later. But anyway, so that's the topic. So we have a bunch of websites. I'm playing. I guess you can't see that, but you can sort of barely see Dragon Cliff in the background there. But let's see over here. So we talked about the adventure game from 1976. This kind of talks a little bit about the history. These Play-Doh, I'm not sure how expensive these. They were really expensive at the time. My dad picked up a Tandy 1000. It was like two or $3,000. He got it in a pretty crazy trade. It wasn't the. I joke with my dad now. He traded a Tandy 1000 for a Snap-on toolbox. To this day, like 40 years later, the Snap-on toolbox is still worth, $3,000 to $4,000, and the computer is garbage. So it's like he traded a computer, which is a fair trade at the time, and it was quite, because he was trying to get out of the body shop business and try to get into more computers because they were the future. And I think it was just kind of too late for him, but not too late for his kids. He ironically now uses his computer, for which everybody does. But I think it really helped his kids get into, me and my brother into programming, and then we played a lot of games. And kind of my older brother was just a huge inspiration. Where we got an Amiga. I think we got an Amiga was one of his first computer games, and then we picked up a different home PC. But then my older brother moved out and took his gaming computer with him, which is really sad. But anyways, and then you can sort of see that MUDs were sort of this idea that they sort of kind of massive. We'll have a list of this, but it's sort of like this. Yeah, it sort of credits the 1976 by Don Wood's venture. Many Dungeons and Dragons features. We talked about the sort of the 1974 Dungeons and Dragons sort of inspiration, and then they sort of went on to here, and then it goes on to say that there was yeah, so better known as EquilinoX and Mud 1 in later years. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Then DikuMud. I think DikuMud is arguably the most famous, which we'll talk a little bit about. And then we've talked about this. There's a minor controversy in late 1999 and early 2000 regarding whether the commercial MMORPG, which they're later called the Massive Multiplayer and Online RPG role-playing game, Everquest, developed by Variant Interactive, had derived its code from DikuMud. It began at the Re-Games conference in 1999, where the director of product development for Everquest, Bernard Yee, allegedly stated that Everquest was based on DikuMud. He did not specify whether he meant the code itself was derived from DikuMud or it's just had a similar feeling. Some attendees had understood it mainly the former and reported to that effect on Usenet. After the Diku group requested clarification, Variant issued a sworn statement on March 17, 2000. Everquest was not based on Diku source code and was built from the ground up. In response, the Diku team publicly stated that they find no reason whatsoever to believe any of the rumors that Everquest was derived from the DikuMud code. So that's sort of this idea that that we can sort of see the etymology of these sort of games with Dungeons and Dragons, with adventure, with Moria, the books, and sort of all these sort of are inspiration as and sort of but the sort of theme was the code base, which is kind of hard. It's like hard pressed to sort of imagine that it wasn't. And I'm not trying to embroil this, but to me it's like it's hard pressed to imagine that that they weren't sort of but I'm not sure what had the access to this code, which is kind of ironic now as the code is freely available. So anyways, here's Everquest, and the screenshot where I took from was started in 1999. This it's still going to this day, Everquest 1, even though they've come out with an Everquest 2. But yeah, I finally tried to get back into Everquest 2 and started, but just never really got into it. Mostly it's the group-based. Anyway, so then we talked about this MUD. This is kind of this MUD Coders Guild, which is pretty awesome that they're talking about coding. So I thought this was pretty good. So we talked about this brandish, quaff, recite, zap, staff, stave, wand, and wands, and then we sort of talked about some of the syntax here, and then sort of this idea. Yeah, so I talked about Diablo a little bit, and then here's some of the more You can talk about, like, here's that sort of adventure mode that you're in a dense forest. There's, sort of this where you're at, and then you can sort of look around and sort of see this. Anyway, so then this sort of talks about Albert mode. Well, not necessarily the grandfather of modern mods, but most certainly is the great uncle. So anyway, so you can sort of see, like, here's the this tree I was talking about. So maybe we'll try to zoom in a little bit. No, that's not helping at all, is it? Okay, well, sorry. But anyways, you can sort of see that there's this sort of Albert did the DikuMud, which then did Daiku, and might have been the Daiku 2 is actually more of where I was at. So then you can sort of see that these are so many just variants, which is kind of ironic nowadays. I think in terms of code based and talking about this, which is kind of it's a pretty serious thing. So anyway, so provided by Daiku as a restaurant in 1990. We talked about this a little bit, and then here's the sworn statement signed by Brad McQuaid, talking about that as programmer on the server side of Everquest. We hereby declare that Everquest was not based on DikuMud source code, nor is there any DikuMud source code in Everquest. Everquest is not a derivation of DikuMud. The Everquest source code was built from the ground up. Everquest has not, in whole or in part, infringed on any copyrighted DikuMud material. I hereby declare that the above is the full truth. So, I mean, it's definitely Brad McQuaid. We actually sort of, I think it's sort of famous. I'm not sure actually if we played on Daiku 2 or if he sort of, it's sort of apparent that he has played on Daiku and talked about a little bit. So, anyways, and then we sort of talked about the Warhammer Fantasy, which I think I should have an entire discussion about this because it's sort of really the inspiration for a lot of this for me in terms of fantasy and role playing. Even though Dungeons and Dragons is, I think this is sort of exciting. Yeah, so it's yeah, so it's just I think it's sort of inspired from Dungeons and Dragons, but it's sort of I like some of the directions that go and talk, and it's what we played in high school. Crazy. Anyway, so yeah, so that's sort of a great talk about. So we talked. I thought well, okay. Well, I thought we had this part. Anyway, so you can talk about. This is part one. Talked about the roguelike, and rogue was the inspiration of that. Part two sort of maybe would be a better adventure, but sort of that seems to have spawned this sort of muds. And then, and then famously DikuMud, and then into, wow, I even misspelled Everquest. Anyways, and then part three, I'm going to be talking about this idea of 2D versus 3D. So it's a definitely sort of, I think the roguelikes are still based on the 2D. I think is a big, the Sharp Accent 2D roguelike, the Rughoos is a 2D, and I've been learning from them, but I've been sort of, developing 3D games, so we're going to be talking about this transition from, in my mind, you can see EverQuest was a 3D based game, and so I don't know if EverQuest is a roguelike. Partly EverQuest is not a roguelike, I think, because of the, it doesn't have procedural dungeons, and doesn't have permadeath, so there are some MMOs that are now coming out that have permadeath. There's a one that's actually pretty cool that you die. You when you die, I think it takes quite a bit while for you to die, but then when you eventually die, you have to create a new character. But you sort of get some of the old stuff. You get your family heirlooms and resources, but you have to create a character, and I think that's pretty cool. And so I'm actually quite interested in how that's going to work, and I would love to try that out, but we'll have to see. I've been getting away from MMOs in general. Just because they're kind of so expensive. I don't really have a group of people to play with and various things like that. So anyway, so hopefully part 3 will be fun. And excuse the misspelling of EverQuest. We'll fix that right now. It's not Everest. Anyway, so just EverQuest I thought was a pretty awesome name. It sort of talked about this idea of the fact that it was just forever. Yeah, see, I got it right there. So it's talking about this forever idea of questing forever. And then, oh, yep, and I misspelled it. And then, anyway, so Warhammer Online was also really cool. I thought Warhammer Online was really awesome in terms of difference as well. So I'm just sad that I didn't really keep up with that. And then I think, a lot of people didn't, and sort of the game ended. Anyway, so thank you very much. We'll see everybody next time. This has been part 7B of the roguelike, and we'll continue part 3 in almost 2 weeks from now, which is crazy. I recorded 7A and 7B back and forth, so I might start working on 7B here, or 7C, and then we'll have I think we'll look at yeah, and then I think I wrote a paper a long time ago about about graphics, and so I might think about that. I think that 2D versus 3D was a great discussion leading into that graphics sort of discussion about Minecraft, and sort of laid the groundwork for all the things that we're doing now in Hamlet. So thanks very much. You take care. I'll see you everybody next time.